Hi everyone, welcome to the final lecture for the semester. We're going to be talking about social theory, which in some ways takes us back to the beginning of the course, and in particular Nathan's model of clarifying terms, where he talked about different forms of epistemology, how you know what you know, and how our epistemology informs the theoretical perspective we take, which in turn informs our methodology and our methods. Examples that Nathan used of theoretical perspectives were positivism, interpretivism, critical inquiry, feminism, and postmodernism. So, for example, if our epistemology is objectivism, our theoretical perspective is likely to be positivism, and therefore our methodology is likely to be experimental and perhaps survey research. So therefore our methods will be statistical analysis, randomized controlled trials, surveys, etc. If our epistemology is constructionism, then our theoretical perspective might be interpretivism, and we might choose ethnography as our methodology, and our methods might then include observation and interviews. We've spent a lot of the course looking at methodologies, for example, ethnography, participatory action research, critical discourse analysis, and of course methods, for example, interviews, observations, and focus groups. Today we're going to spend some time talking about how we can interpret data using social theories. It is possible to gather data to demonstrate the facts, so to speak, and this is seen as an empiricist approach, that the facts are assumed to exist prior to the theories which explain them. But there's usually a reason why we want to gather particular data. There's something that precedes the counting. Take, for example, the census. We talked in week 1 about the census providing quantitative data, but if we wanted to find out why Australians live as they do, we look to qualitative research for that. But there's a reason for why we take the census data in the first place. According to the ABS, the census data, and I'm quoting, is used by people and organisations all over Australia to plan for services and infrastructure such as roads, childcare, hospitals and schools for every community in our nation. So the explanation or theory for conducting a census is that the data will allow the nation to predict and plan for the future. As Australian sociologist Robert Van Krieken says, we actually can't escape theories.
It's important to realise that it's actually impossible to escape from theorising. We do it all the time to make sense of the complexity of social organisation, something we're provoked to do whenever our tried and trusted recipes for living fail us. This is why the most productive periods in social thought are those in which taken for granted assumptions are particularly unstable, when for any number of reasons there's no longer a widely shared consensus about how society should be organised. Really, there's no such thing as non-theoretical, purely empirical research in the social sciences. Theory is just another word for thought, for how we make sense of and organise what we see, how we draw conclusions, and how we speak. So it matters a lot which theory we start with and whether we're even conscious of the theory we're using. Our choice of theory has a decisive impact on what we'll count as facts, evidence, and what we'll recognise as valid conclusions and inferences. If a researcher chooses not to talk about their theoretical orientation, all this means is that it's buried deep within their definition of their research problem, their identification of the issues worth paying attention to, their methodology, and the kinds of conclusions they regard as plausible and persuasive. You can have enormous fun, if you're so inclined, digging out the theoretical presumptions of work produced by social researchers who say nothing about their theoretical orientation.
Theories all the time, even before we come to university and begin thinking about them in a formal way. For example, if we look outside and decide to take an umbrella, we're applying a theory because we've made a prediction of what might happen. You can control whether you get wet or stay dry. Plus, you're influenced by something, the dark clouds in the sky, drops of rain. When you observe the process, such as the darker clouds or even the feel or smell of humidity in the atmosphere, and it does start raining, you theorise or explain or attribute the cause to the particular clouds and atmospheric conditions. You know that rain can cause difficulties like getting wet or hazardous driving conditions, but we also know, especially in South Australia, that rain is a good thing. So there are directives or guidance for being safe and knowledge that rain is a benefit or can improve the world. Prediction, control, influence, process, cause, guidance, and improvement are some of the components that go into making a theory. Lots of old folk sayings or proverbs are actually theories. A dollar saved is a dollar earned suggests you should save money. If you save small amounts over a long term, this will add up. So the prediction part is that if we save money, it will accumulate. The control part is that we can guarantee our economic future if we work hard, save and are frugal with our money. Other proverbs like this are where there's smoke, there's fire, and if you lie down with dogs, you'll wake up with fleas. With out of sight, out of mind, the idea is that we might forget about something because it's not visible. So we've got a cause in there. We're explaining how something happens by stating its cause. We're also predicting we might forget something, and we can take some control by making the event, for example, visible in a calendar. Sometimes theories are presented and even passed on as if they're facts rather than a theory, and they can even permeate an entire culture. Do you remember in week 5 I talked to you about interviewing Tasmanian writer James Boyce at the 2015 Adelaide Writers' Week? What Boyce does in Born Bad is explore the history of the Christian theory or doctrine or teaching of original sin, which in brief says that because the creation story characters Adam and Eve, because they were disobedient and because they were banished from the Garden of Eden, their fall has been inherited by all of humanity. This means that humanity has inherited the tendency to do what's wrong rather than what's right. We're all born bad and permanently separated from the divine, at least until individual Christians accept Jesus as mediator and saviour. That's the Orthodox Christian view of humanity, and in Born Bad, Boyce explores this history from when Augustine, who was born in 354 AD, when he first promulgated it. No matter how much Augustine wanted to be celibate, he couldn't manage it, and he attributed this and other flaws in his character to an ancestral attraction to sin. Generalizing from his own experience, Augustine decided that rather than humanity having at their core an inherent goodness, we have instead an inherent badness. Boyce argues that although the influence of the doctrinal teaching has waned along with Christian influence more generally, it survives on in the collective unconscious. We Westerners continue to feel as if there's something inherently wrong with us. We still feel bad at our core. Even eminent scientists who renounce religion, for example Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud and Richard Dawkins, have all been imbued with the notion of original sin, says James Boyce, but they refract their conclusions of humanity's inherent propensity to be violent, cruel and selfish through a scientific rather than a religious lens. So Dawkins' selfish gene is nothing new, says Boyce. Instead, what Dawkins actually does is provide a contemporary terminology for what people already think. James Boyce and expelled Dominican priest Matthew Fox argue that the doctrine of original sin serves those in power, that it keeps people in line. Then it's not hard to see, therefore, why Fox was expelled. According to James Boyce, then, Western culture has been affected by one man generalizing from his own experience, which makes me think of a quotation from David Silverman. Even when we decide to use qualitative or quantitative methods, we involve ourselves in theoretical as well as methodological decisions. These decisions relate not only to how we conceptualize the world, but also to our theory of how our research subjects think about things. Theory, then, should be neither a status symbol nor an optional extra in a research study. Without theory, research is impossibly narrow. Without research, theory is mere armchair contemplation. And here's a contemporary example of some armchair, or rather plant-side, contemplation.
Life in North Orange blamed on 5G radio waves.
Yes, forget coronavirus. 5G is now responsible for impeding the growth of trees. One local resident started a Facebook group called Stop 5G in Orange, and that's all the hook the local paper needed to report.
Mrs. Baker noticed changes to plant life while living in Terry Turner Crescent about a year ago. It is near a large water tower which also features a phone tower. The problems included missing branches and sparse or shrivelling leaves.
Missing branches, shrivelling leaves. According to the paper, there was only one answer.
Mrs. Baker believed the irregular growth matched the direction of the electromagnetic waves from the tower.
Now, there are two problems with this theory, neither of which the newspaper bothered to consider. One, the notion of flora responding to electromagnetic waves is rubbish. Dr. Ken Karapides of Australia's Radiation Safety Agency told us...
There is no established evidence that low-level radio wave exposure from 5G and other wireless telecommunications can affect plant growth.
And the second, possibly bigger problem? We'll leave that to one of the Facebook comments on the story.
Wake up! There is no 5G in Orange yet.
Yep, spot on. We asked the telco regulators and Telstra and Optus themselves, and all said there are currently no 5G signals active in the Orange region. So we put that to the editor of the Central Western Daily, who told MediaWatch,
"The error about 5G in the original article has now been corrected in print and online."
Theories as being behind gathering data like the census, or even very deep as Van Grieken suggests. And we've looked at theories as contained in neat statements known as aphorisms or proverbs or folk sayings. Let's move on now to talking about social theories in particular. Broadly speaking, social theories are analytical frameworks or paradigms or models used to examine social phenomena. The term social theory encompasses ideas about how societies change and develop, about methods of explaining social behaviour, about power and social structure, gender and ethnicity, modernity and civilization, revolutions and utopias. I like to think about social theories as tools in a thinking or intellectual toolbox, and some people will have lots of tools in their toolbox, others will know a lot about a smaller number. Social theories are basically explanations for the way that social and cultural life works. Some people who develop social theories, social theorists they're often called, develop the status of rock stars, but they're really people like us who are trying to understand the way the world works. We all develop theories, but the best social theorists strike a chord with a large number of people, and their work really resonates and then gets picked up and applied often around the world. This is what David Inglis is saying in this quote. Social theorists of all varieties, even the most eminent and highly regarded ones, are not that much different from you and me, but they are sometimes presented as if they are. This is especially so, it seems, in Britain and places influenced by an academic culture, where certain social theorists are particularly set up on pedestals and treated as if they were wholly unique human beings. The very best social theory is worth getting to know and understand because it will help you see the world in new, more sophisticated ways, but ways you often already had some awareness of. Some of the best social theorists have the knack of putting into words things you only dimly perceived before. And it pays to remember, as per the quote I'm going to read now, that social theories are human products with an institutional history and micropolitics of their own. Theory can sometimes look as if it has a life independent of human agency, with the objective hardness of a thing enshrined in textbooks that appear to give it a solid, fixed quality. Theories are then handed down to new generations of students who learn the truths of rival camps and come to recognise familiar disputes. But social theory is, in fact, much more fluid than this and should be used and shaped by practising researchers rather than mechanically determining their action. In a nutshell, people often use theories without making them explicit or labelling them as such. Theory helps us as researchers see the forest instead of a jumble of single trees and other critters, as Amanda Flame was talking about last week. And theory also helps us to connect a single study, our study, to an enormous base of knowledge to which other researchers have already contributed. Theory is about seeing links, generalising, abstracting ideas from your data and offering explanations, connecting your own findings, as I just said, with those of others, and having insights. If you're not clear on how to theorise your data, David Silverman has some ideas. You could use a chronological approach, for example, considering processes of change, how the research problem even came into being. Michel Foucault, and as you probably already know, was interested in how prisons came into being. He was also interested in the development of the medical profession and how teaching hospitals came into being as well. You could try a contextual approach. What is the organisational, economic, social, political context of the research problem? I've been interested in students and academics from working class backgrounds, for example, them coming into the university and then exploring what it's like for them given the context of the university as an elite institution, and then the concerns for students who can often feel like a fish out of water. When you do your background or literature review for your final essay, you'll probably discover some theories are used more than others in some fields of research. For example, Bourdieu is often used when thinking about intergenerational privilege and how difficult it can be for students from impoverished backgrounds to get into elite universities.
Pierre Bourdieu, and is the cultural knowledge that serves as currency that helps us navigate culture and alters our experiences and the opportunities available to us. While cultural capital can be material objects such as clothing or what car you drive, Bourdieu also focused on the symbolic elements that embodied cultural capital, such as tastes, manners, skills, and credentials that one receives or earns. Cultural capital really isn't about economics or how much money you have, but it can be exchanged for money. And the crazy thing is this money can help you earn more cultural capital. According to Bourdieu, cultural capital can be a source of social inequality too. It is hard for those who are poor or who are part of the working class to gain the types of cultural capital that are valued in society. For example, having an education and earning a degree is a very important piece of cultural capital. Let's say a student in poverty has difficulty finding time to study because he works evenings to help support his low-income family. This leads to poor performance due to his lack of studying, which results in lower test scores and then being placed in lower ability classes, which in turn affects his GPA and what college he is able to get into, if he goes to college at all. In the United States, if you are in a lower social class, such as the student in our example, you tend to have less cultural capital. The upper and middle social classes have more cultural capital, and therefore their social class views tend to dominate in culture. Society also tends to give them more prestige.
Silverman's third example is doing a comparison between a couple of groups. And if I continue on with the example of university, there have been studies done on what it's like for students from state schools compared to students from private schools at university. Often students from state schools get far less support in their schools because the funding is far less than in private school. But it turns out that can be an advantage at university because students at university are supposed to be self-directed, and those state school students have often been more prepared for that. They're more independent and therefore they can cope better. When it comes to implications, which is the fourth example, I did talk last week about research having an effect on policy and practice. Today I'd like to talk about the mid-20th century work of Irving Goffman, and we've come across him already a couple of times in the course. In the mid-1950s, he did an ethnographic study of a psychiatric facility based in Washington and concluded that the facility was rather like a prison, even though most inmates hadn't committed any crime. So he was able to compare his one example of a psychiatric facility and actually translate that across and explain other groups like boarding schools and orphanages and prisons. His work actually contributed to the deinstitutionalization of mental health patients in the West from the 1970s, and that's had both benefits and caused problems. But his study has had implications for other groups too, like children growing up in those orphanages and children's homes, and even children in boarding schools. He called these institutions total institutions because they had barriers to the outside world, very little contact to the outside world outside of the institution. And he saw similarities, therefore, between them. Joanna Penglaze in Australia drew on his work when reflecting on adult experiences of growing up in orphanages and children's homes here. And Silverman's final point is that you can think laterally and explore a whole range of theories, methodologies, and methods in the one project. It can also be really, really helpful to listen to social theorists who've already come up and listen to them about how they've gone about developing their theories. So let's have a listen to African-American Kimberly Crenshaw about how she came upon her theory or developed her theory of intersectionality.
Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma DeGraffenreid. Emma DeGraffenreid was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say, that the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma DeGraffenreid was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But, of course, neither African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial, and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me.
But intersectionality actually didn't work for Kurdish-Iranian writer Behrouz Boochani.
Earlier this week, Australia's richest literary prize was awarded for a book written by text message. The author is this man, Behrouz Boochani. He's a Kurdish-Iranian refugee who detailed the despair of his many years in limbo inside an Australian offshore detention centre. He wasn't allowed to attend the ceremony in Melbourne to pick up his prize. He told DW, however, that receiving the award has been bittersweet.
It is a big achievement for me, for the refugees on Manus Island and Nauru, and also for all of the refugees and stateless people around the world. I myself still am living in this island, and we have lost many things over the past 6 years, and that's why I think I cannot have celebration. I cannot celebrate my this award and this achievement.
There's author and refugee Behrouz Boochani there, and with me here is DW reporter Jared Reed. Tell us more about this man.
So Behrouz Boochani is a Kurdish journalist who fled Iran some years ago and sought refuge in Australia. He arrived there by boat, but due to Australia's hardline immigration policies, he was sent to a detention centre outside of Australia's borders. And in this case, it is called Manus Island. It's an island administered by Papua New Guinea. And Boochani has been there since 2013. In the years since then, he's become one of the best-known voices from inside Australia's offshore detention system, describing quite often on Twitter and online what he says are inhumane conditions and human rights abuses committed there. These pictures we're looking at are from a documentary he was able to shoot using his phone inside the Manus Centre.
And he wrote the book on his phone.
That's right. He typed it out by text message and sent it through the service WhatsApp to a translator in Australia. And these are some of the chunks of text that he sent. These screenshots were sent to us by the translator Omid Tafigian. Boochani was worried guards would take his writing, which is why he just kind of wanted to get it out and send it to his translator as soon as he could. And these texts became this book here. It's called No Friend But the Mountains, writing from Manus Prison, which Behrouz Boochani himself describes as the product of years of imprisonment and systematic torture, both on him and other refugees. And what he's talking about there are the stories that have come out of Manus Island and Nauru, another Pacific island where Australia has a detention centre, of human rights abuses being committed. So refugees harming themselves, of living in very poor conditions, of riots. So Boochani won this very rich prize, around 60,000 euros worth, but he wasn't able to attend the ceremony to get the award.
Boochani uses the theory, or a theory called kyriarchy, to explain the intersecting system of domination and oppression in the Manus Island detention centre.
Kyriarchy. Kyriarchy.
Kyriarchy is a theory developed by Harvard feminist theologian Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, and she developed it to explain a system of intersecting oppressions, class, ability, ethnicity, education, etc., where patriarchy means the rule of the father and explains how male authority has subjugated women. Kyriarchy explains how women can be victims of oppression on the one hand and oppressors on the other. For example, they've been complicit in slave owning and in removing Indigenous children from their parents during what's known as the stolen generation. At first glance, it looks like there's simply a hierarchy operating in the Manus Island Detention Centre, particularly since you've got refugees at the bottom of the system. But if you look a bit closer, you'll see why Kyriaki works better for Buchani as a theoretical framework, particularly because of intersections of race and ethnicity. Most of the refugees were men of colour. Many were from the Middle East, and they included university-educated men, like Buchani. Next up were Papu men. Part of the arrangement was that if Australia used the Manus Island Detention Centre, they had to employ Papu men in the prison. So they did, but Buchani says they had no authority or autonomy in the prison at all. They had to do what the white Australians told them to do. Above the Papu guards were these white Australians, and they reported to bosses who reported to bosses who reported to bosses. The detention centre was operated by the British corporation, G4S, so white Australians were reporting in to British citizens at some level. Buchani was in a men's prison, of course, and there weren't many women, but they were there. They were there as medical staff and as lawyers for the Australian Department of Immigration. So Kyriaki makes sense as a way of explaining what was going on in the Manus Island Detention Centre, but it doesn't really explain how Australia came to the decision of keeping people in offshore or in any sort of detention centres onshore or offshore. So I've gone to Mary Douglas's theory in her book called Purity and Danger to see whether I can make sense of the coming into being of the Manus Detention Centre. Many of you doing anthropology have probably already come across Mary Douglas already. What she's been interested in is how concepts of taboo have come into being in the West, which of course, as you would know, is founded on Christianity, which in turn has its roots in Judaism. Mary Douglas has gone to the food prohibitions in the book of Leviticus, which is in what Christians call the Old Scriptures, but they're also known as the Hebrew Scriptures. And what she's done is ask these questions. Why should the camel, the hare and the rock badger be seen as unclean or not fit to eat? Why should some locusts, but not all, be unclean? Why should the frog be clean and the mouse and the hippopotamus unclean? What have chameleons, moles and crocodiles got in common that they should be listed together? So what Mary Douglas did was draw on an anthropological theory of classification structuralism to highlight a cultural logic to these classifications. And she argues that different cultures have classificatory systems and they use those to bring order to their worlds. And it's at the margins or boundaries of these systems that categories are most threatened and vulnerable. Some things, people, materials, events or behaviours will not easily fit into a category and move to another, or they may be entirely ambiguous in their positioning. Categories that blur, smudge, contradict or confuse classifications are considered dirt. And what is marginal when labelled as dirt, Douglas argues, is also considered to be physically and socially polluting and dangerous. Mary Douglas develops this concept of dirt as matter out of place. She says that animals that fully conform to their classifications, such as birds that fly, fish that have fins and scales, and animals that walk on all 4 feet, chew their cud and have cloven hooves, are considered clean. But pigs and camels are cloven-footed, but they're not ruminant, meaning they don't chew the cud, and therefore they're considered unclean and dirty. According to this particular dietary system, these animals are regarded as clean and therefore edible. Ox, cow, goat, sheep, gazelle, ibex and antelope. Animals that don't fit neatly into boundaries are unclean and therefore unedible. So there's pigs, which are cloven-hoofed but not cud-chewing, and then there's the camel, the hare and the rock badger, which are cud-chewing but not cloven-hoofed. Animals that cross boundaries of habitat by creeping and crawling and swarming and don't adhere to rigid categories are considered unclean and dangerous. And you can see how snakes, therefore, are considered dangerous because they can slither on land and on water as well. Mary Douglas went on to apply her classification of boundaries to the body. So she sees the body as a bounded system and most vulnerable at its margins, like the skin and any external openings for the mouth and the nose, etc. So matter coming from these orifices are seen as defiling because they cross bodily boundaries: spit, faeces, menstrual blood, urine, semen, phlegm. When these fluids are in the body, they're in their proper place. Outside of the body, they are matter out of place and hence dirty. The human body is also a model which can stand for any bounded system, so it can stand in as a symbol of society. Therefore, the boundaries can represent any boundaries which are threatened or are precarious. The concept of dirt as a cultural logic of pollution, marginality and danger can therefore be consigned to categories of people like lepers, psychiatric patients, occupational groups such as sex workers, particular sexual practices like homosexuality has been in the past, criminals who are often located in prisons literally on the geographic boundaries of cities, and also think about ethnic cleansing, where societies want to clean out particular groups of people from their societies. Are asylum seekers inserted into this cultural logic? Refugees, asylum seekers are out of place as they have left their homelands. They are quintessentially displaced, and they are crossing geographical boundaries in leaky boats, thus threatening the intact borders of nation states. Much of the language of media representations around asylum seekers has fitted quite well into Mary Douglas's ideas of boundaries and crossing boundaries, and how that can feel very dangerous particularly for nation states. So there's the languages of waves and tides and floods of illegal immigrants that will swamp us, slip through, sneak in, invade, particularly with false papers or no papers, having exotic diseases and sicknesses, being criminals or gangs or terrorists, and that idea of queue jumping that we were talking about last week, so not being orderly, quarantined, then in marginal locations, sometimes in places where nuclear waste has been or can be dumped, where nuclear testing was conducted in the wastelands, and including offshore and away from Australia in Manus Island. So Mary Douglas's work on purity and danger and matter out of place is one theory that we could use to explain Australia's penchant for detention centres for asylum seekers for quite a long period of time. It doesn't negate at all what Behrouz Boochani was writing about and using kyriarchy as a theoretical framework, but it probably just complements it really. Well, I reckon that's enough talking about social theories for one day. So thanks very much for listening. Thank you very much for attending the lectures and the classes. And to finish the course on a positive note, Behrouz Boochani was finally granted asylum, but not in Australia. It was New Zealand who took him in.
A refugee who was held on an island in the Pacific for 6 years by the Australian government has been granted asylum in New Zealand.
It means Behrouz Boochani, an author known as the voice of Manus Island, can stay here indefinitely. Thomas Mead spoke to him.
Today, Behrouz Boochani starts a brand new chapter, standing on the grounds of Canterbury University, free to discuss his brand new research project.
For me, it is a great feeling, and I'm happy that now I have a certainty.
But for 6 years, this was his reality on Manus Island in the Pacific, held by the Australian government after they intercepted him trying to escape violence in Iran. That changed 8 months ago when he flew to New Zealand on a temporary visa to speak at a writers' festival. He stayed on, applying, as is his right, for asylum, and has now been granted it.
I enjoy simple things, in my life. It's very simple things.
He can now seek residency and has been appointed as a senior adjunct research fellow here at UC.
Behrouz is already collaborating with colleagues on Pacific and migrant rights, and he'll also be involved in art installation and film.
Politicians split on the decision.
Well, it's a proud day for New Zealand. We get to stand for having a functioning refugee determination system for one thing, but also for kindness and for fairness.
Well, I think it's outrageous. I think he should not have been allowed into the country or a visa in the first place when there are Afghani and Iranian people with good travel histories who have family in New Zealand who aren't granted visitors' visas because of their risk of seeking asylum.
After so much hardship, Boochani is unfazed by criticism.
I have been facing this kind of politicians in whole my life, and that's why I am here.
The journalist and author who wrote an award-winning book by text while in detention is vowing to continue his fight.
Of course, I cannot fully celebrate this and enjoy. Some people are in indefinite detention in Australia, in Port Moresby, in Nauru.
The voice of Manus Island now free to speak out forever. Thomas Mead, One News.